Good evening. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California, and it's broadcast number 602, June the 20th, 1983. A year ago this week, that was broadcast number 550, I was discussing the arrangement of certain people very important to the history of the past year, the particular configuration of Edwin Wilson and the Pope and Raymond Donovan, Secretary of Labor, and their travels in Europe and their paths crossing in these various cities, and the interrelationship of these particular people to each other. Ronald Reagan had been in London and at Versailles for the conference of the heads of leaders of Europe, and then he flew to Houston, Texas, where he met with the Republicans and decided on the 20th anniversary of the murder of John Kennedy that they would hold a Republican convention in the year 1984 in Dallas, Texas. That was immediately after his return from Europe. Edwin Wilson, a top official who worked in the Central Intelligence Agency with Vice President Bush when he was director of the CIA, who was head of Task Force 157 with Navy intelligence. Edwin Wilson was arrested that week. He was in Zurich. He had picked up $18 million and was to be brought back to the United States by way of Dominican Republic. He was arrested at that same time, and he had important connections to our vice president, who someday could be president of the United States, and he was linked to various activists in Israel and Palestine, with the PLO rather, involved in the Munich Games, the assassinations at the Munich Games. The Israelis had captured people that had worked with Edwin Wilson, and Carlos, who worked with Edwin Wilson, was in Beirut, Lebanon. He may be there now with Frank Turpel, who's also over there. But Wilson was picked up in Zurich, and it's in Zurich where the gun was supplied to Agen for the shooting of the Pope. And in the past year, it's come out how Edwin Turpel, Frank Turpel rather, trained him over in Lebanon for shooting and was allegedly in Rome at the time of the shooting. It's close to where the Pope was. Frank Turpel was there at the time. Edwin Wilson had met with members of the Justice Department in Rome and was not arrested earlier, and then the Wilson-Turpel connections to the Agen shooting have surfaced in the past year, but Wilson was picked up the same week that John Paul II was in Geneva. He was at a labor conference with Secretary of Labor Raymond Donovan, who just this last week was once more cleared for his links with the organized crime syndicate, which is impossible to clear him, but for the Justice Department, the Reagan Justice Department, or the Carter, or any of the others going back, all signs were clear that Raymond Donovan isn't tainted enough to be removed as the Secretary of Labor. As a matter of fact, the man who lied to Congress, and it was in the newspapers this week, a year later, Francis M. Mullen, M-U-L-L-E-N, wants to be head of the Drug Enforcement Agency, and he's the one who kept from Congress as if they needed protection for their eyes from the links of Raymond Donovan to the mob. So now he wants to go on and be head of the entire drug agency, and if the Senate allows it this week, he'll be cleared through that. But Donovan was in Switzerland, the Pope was in Switzerland, Frank Turpel was in Lebanon with his team, but Wilson was arrested. George Corcola, the third part of that team of CIA funding terrorists, and using Wilson, Turpel, and Corcola, men involved with the assassinations going right back to John Kennedy's assassination, this triumvirate was to be closed in first with the arrest of Edwin Wilson. And, of course, he's in jail at the present time, but his cases have been hushed up. If you've noticed how quietly they've been hushed up. Once Kevin McCullough was murdered, a primary witness, it seems that we don't hear a thing about Edwin Wilson. His case is so high up that I think they're afraid to give it too much publicity at the time. But the known connections of Ronald Reagan to organized crime were illustrated through many articles through the past years, and as I said on the broadcast just a year ago and on the sheet that accompanies that broadcast, Ronald Reagan must protect and appoint the mob because they made him president. They used the assassination teams to get rid of those opponents in his way. Richard Nixon was put into office after the murder of John Kennedy. Careful strategy that allowed him in. Mary Jo Kopechne was murdered so that Ted Kennedy would be smeared out. George Wallace was shot and not killed. He survived that assault. Robert Kennedy was murdered, and with John and Robert out of the way, it cleared the way for Richard Nixon. And then, of course, Nelson Rockefeller was deep-sixed, and Ronald Reagan was in. The selected people, as I said a long time ago, were Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan as the presidents, and the role that the mob plays is getting rid of those people that stand in their way while the international bankers and the top mobsters select who they want to be president of the United States. I was talking about those interconnecting links a year ago, and many of you might have seen the Wall Street Journal just today. I'll do more on it later. It's a discussion of Paul Laxalt, who is Ronald Reagan's best friend, former governor of Las Vegas, of Nevada. I call it the state of Las Vegas. It tells about his close relationship with Mo Dalitz, that he's very fond of Mo Dalitz. Mo Dalitz's home is where Robert Mayu resided when Howard Hughes' organization moved into Vegas, and Mayu at the time was employed by the CIA to hire John Rosselli and Sam Giancana as assassins for the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, Laxalt says, well, I may have had some indiscretions, but now that I'm running the campaign for Ronald Reagan or want to be president, I guess I'll have to be more careful because this is the way we do things out west, but this is an Eastern view and they're unfair. I guess he's referring to George Bush and the assault, at least the cover assault on some of the crime syndicate that the CIA is running, and Bush, as director of the CIA at one time, would know. And rightly so, according to Laxalt, the CIA was involved in narcotics traffic itself and is continuously, so it is unfair to just take one pot shot at Paul Laxalt. And he says this is a Western problem. Well, the narcotics market is $80 billion a year, and it goes into every major city of the United States and around the world. It's more than a local problem. But this particular article reminds me of the cowboy and the rivalry between the cowboy and the Eastern establishment, picking on Paul Laxalt now instead of going, say, to the Nugan Hand Bank and the massive narcotics traffic when George Bush was director of the CIA. It has to be a total cleanup, and just pointing to one element is childish, and right now they're pointing the finger at Paul Laxalt, but he's got the answers. He says, you all do the same thing wherever you are and get off my back, and I'm sure that most people will have to put up with this until they've had enough, and then someday the crime syndicate will go all the way up to the White House and you'll realize who's running the show. There's several articles. I'm not going into detail now. I just want to mention them so that you know I have them. One is Roger Arnold, a man, a suspect in quotes, who was never arrested, who's been charged with slaying a person in Chicago he thought was the informer on his case with the Tylenol scandal. Now, Arnold's the man who had the 2 passports to Southeast Asia, that worked with a travel agency in Chicago, and I believe that he is linked to the John DeLorean network, the Continental Bank, Illinois in Chicago. He should have been arrested a long time ago, but he just wiped out a person that he thought was a informer on his past, and he's been charged with murder, not with the Tylenol murders, but with murdering a witness to the case. Also in the New York Times this week, there was a large story titled Murder Leading to Foreign Intrigues, and that's about George M. Perry, P-E-R-R-Y. I mentioned him a while back. He's the fellow who was the General Motors executive, the multimillionaire with his various connections into Zurich and Brazil and all over the world. Now he's tied to international narcotics traffic and conspiracy to sell cocaine in New York, identical to John DeLorean, also out of General Motors and a major cocaine operation going there. Broadcast 572, November 22nd, 1982. I was talking about John DeLorean. DeLorean was arrested the end of November in 1982, and 1 month later, just the month of December passed, and January the 8th, his co-partner, or a man from General Motors, another multimillionaire, was found dead. Now they believe that he was dropped out of a helicopter from upstate New York. I'll do more on the DeLorean cocaine connections, and I do want to do 1 hour on the links to the Tylenol. I think tie into that scandal and to the IG Farb and Sterling Drug versus Johnson & Johnson war. The National Examiner has a story. Marilyn Monroe was kidnapped and confined for 22 years, and then they have my picture there I did give part of the story of the role of Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy with Marilyn Monroe and the wiretap work of Bernard Spindell. I got that from the book Spooks by Jim Hogan. And they put in another person who I don't know, saying she's alive in Alaska. Then they jump to the second part, which I did in fact give them, and then it makes it look like I believe that she is still alive. That's not true, and I have to get to them. I haven't had a chance to get to them. I just heard about the story and picked up the issue yesterday, so I'll get in touch with the Examiner. They never retrieve or change anything for sure. Now, there's a researcher up in the Bay Area who is doing a fantastic job of outlining the broadcasts that I'm doing, tape recording them and outlining them. And this is the way I see things when I plan the broadcast. I spend 10 or 12 hours laying out the material and seeing a linear connection between the subjects that I bring up on the broadcast. And he breaks them down into names and operations and how they link to each other. It's an excellent idea. In one of the sheets, maybe in a week or two, I'll put you a sample of an outline if it's all right with him. And it would be a good way to get a book out is to have before the chapter, just as I do the sheets that accompany the broadcast, have these interconnecting outlines so people can visualize the relationship of one operation to the other. For example, he takes Helmut Stryker that I talk about and has him working for the United States and in the Russian front and the Battle of the Bulge, and then branches out to Reinhard Gehlen, Otto Skorzeny, the German generals, the OSS, the CIA. It's an ingenious way of doing things, and I think I'll copy one or two of his charts and send them on to you so that you can get an idea of how they look, and maybe I should start doing that each week. Also, Mother Jones has an article by Martin A. Lee, L-E-E, called There Will Be Done. It's about the Vatican, it's about the Michael Sindona, Reinhard Gehlen, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Opus Dei, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. It's a very good article. There's pictures of James Angleton and Galen and Pope Pius XII, John McCone of the CIA, Cardinal Spellman, J. Peter Grace. Again, these articles, just as my research, should be diagrammed more than just a story that is told. There's so much information here that I'm sure nobody can remember these facts. What I do with an article like this is outline it. I spend hours outlining articles, so that when I get this into subjects 1, 2, 3, and 4, I'll share them with you on the air. Many of you have it, and the reason I mention it now is get it if you don't have it. And also, I don't know if I mentioned last week, John Judge sent me the article on Princess Grace, A World Without Grace, 7 unanswered questions about her death. And again, I will outline that and share that with you, but I'm putting it off right now because I want to continue along with the story of Robert Byron Watson. I read to you last week a letter he wrote to me. I want to share with you this week a letter that David Wemple got from him, or information from him, and shared with me, because I want to follow a sequential order of this particular person who claims that he heard these people talking about the murder of Martin Luther King. And a month later, Robert Kennedy was killed, but they had been talking about Sirhan, the patsy, and they didn't hear the threat on Robert Kennedy, but they heard the talk of this Palestinian that they were going to use for a job, evidently. And the important thing is the discussion of these assassinations and the people involved and their relationship to the present Western Goals Organization, to Roy Cohn, to the military. I've given you their names, the people involved in the military, and the files that belong to Larry McDonald. He's the guy that is chasing the Reds all over the world, the staunchest right-wing advocate. He is today the person who is screaming the most, along with 1 or 2 other people, but he is the hierarchy of the Birch Society now. He's been given the control of it, the head of it, by Robert Welch. And I want to go into the background of the Birch Society because Larry McDonald has been active there, and share with you some more information about Larry McDonald and the network that he works with in Chile and in Lebanon, because it is part of the international assassination team. Before I get into Robert Byron Watson and part 2 of that, I just want to mention 3 articles that were in the newspaper today, because it shows how pertinent these subjects are to the news every single day. The Monterey Herald has a large picture of Senator Joe McCarthy in front of a table, and Mr. James Wickstrom, W-I-C-K-S-T-R-O-M, is holding a press conference, and the title is Posse Comitatus Boss Claims Big Membership. And it tells about the right-wing militant group, the Posse, P-O-S-S-E, in case you don't have that, capital C-O-M-I-T-A-T-U-S. They're racist, they're anti-Semitic, they're anti-government, and they're against Ronald Reagan, incidentally. This article says Reagan is as conservative as the man in the moon. Now, this group don't like Ronald Reagan, and if you remember, or maybe you don't remember, John Hinckley Jr. was a member of the Posse Comitatus. I might have mentioned to you privately or on the air that the time that Hinckley was in front of my house, I believed it was Hinckley. The Secret Service and the FBI put it off, but a week later they came to the house because a car that the license number that I took was registered to a friend of John Hinckley's who was a member of the Posse Comitatus that was in front of my home. This is a group run by the Life Science Church. It was formed 30 years ago in Minnesota. It's very far right-wing, and as I say, it's funded by a large group of fundamentalists and small and large corporations. It would be really interesting to know which large corporations, such I probably would guess J. Peter Grace and that gang. But Joe McCarthy's picture was in the paper today. Then there was another article by the ACLU chief. His name is Ira Glasser, G-L-A-S-S-E-R, and he was saying that Ronald Reagan's policies are so far right, they're much farther and much more serious threat than President Nixon or Senator Joe McCarthy ever were, and that he wants to violate the Bill of Rights, and his primary goal is a different ideology than that of the current Bill of Rights. So on the one hand, the Civil Liberties Union is saying Reagan is farther right than Joe McCarthy or Nixon, and the Posse Comitatus the same day is saying Ronald Reagan is a pussycat. You'd hardly have to believe him. And the third article in the news today that ties these three together, the common denominator, is the Nazis in Germany had a riot. 46 officers were injured. 230 people were arrested. A group called the Conservative Action was active for 12 hours this last weekend in Berlin. Now, there is a constant resurgence of the Nazis. You may see it more and more in the newspapers, and my articles are just bulging with stories of Nazis. You see Joe McCarthy's name when Larry McDonald talks, when the Posse Comitatus talks, and you see articles that Reagan is doing away with the civil liberties. Well, where did this all begin? Where did it converge? And this is a subject that I've been studying continuously, how bad this situation is and how far back it goes. Now, I have a book I obtained called Hitler Directs His War. It was published in 1950 by Felix Gilbert. It was translated and edited by Felix Gilbert. And the interesting part of this book is that, one of the interesting parts is that when the war was over, 2 days before it was officially over, actually May the 8th, 1945 was official, the 101st Airborne Division arrived at Berchtesgaden. That's Hitler's special place, B-E-R-C-H-T-E-S-G-A-D-E-N, Berchtesgaden. They arrived there May the 5th. The Divisional Counterintelligence Office was to be opened up. And the fellow who arrived there found that Hitler's stenographer was there, the person who had taken all the records of Hitler's daily meetings at Hitler's headquarters from 1942 up through 1945. He was there. So the American contemporary policy of the Counterintelligence Corps, they call them the CIC, their policy was, they had decided was to arrest and send the Nazis to internment camps. But these particular people that arrived, the 101st Airborne, decided that they wouldn't send them with the SS to be imprisoned, that they were more useful to the CIC team, and they would keep them at Berchtesgaden and have what he said was a living link with Hitler. And this is important. The reason I bring Senator Joe McCarthy in is because if you have the back broadcast, I name the specific Germans who put Senator Joe McCarthy into office, specifically ran his campaign when he came home from being in military intelligence in the Marines, Navy intelligence, and put him in for senator from Wisconsin. And from Germany, going back and forth to Germany, they put up this money, and then Senator Joe McCarthy released the prisoners from Malmedy that were at the Dachau prison, and his claim to fame was releasing them and getting them all out to start all over again. So McCarthy is important to these Nazis. And the American team went in there and on their own wanted a living link with Hitler. That's what the word they used. And they had certain people like Julius Streicher, Streicher, who later was hung at Nuremberg, but none of the others were. A Dr. Robert Ley, L-E-Y, and it lists the people who were with Adolf Hitler's team at Berchtesgaden, including his sister Paula and his personal physician, Dr. Morell, M-O-R-E-L-L. I never trusted Morell, incidentally, and I believe that it was his account that Hitler was syphilitic, insane, and just incoherent. I believe that Hitler was none of those things, and that Morell was the liar. And Morell is writing the history later, and as the book says, Hitler directs his war. He was anything but insane. Well, Morell was working with the American group there, and they say on their own, but there's a lot of proof or belief, of course, that they had planned this a long time ago. And they worked with the generals and the household, and they ignored the usual procedures. According to this fellow, they had tons of documents, and they kept these men at their disposal, and they were free. And he said it was almost historic, almost historic. They were justified by the uniqueness of the situation. And then the stenographers came in, and a Dr. Jonaschat, Jonuschat, came back with a Dr. Kurt Peschel, P-E-S-C-H-E-L, the head of the stenographic service of Hitler's headquarters, and Herr Ludwig Krieger, director of the service at the Reichstag, K-R-I-E-G-E-R, and Dr. Edward Reinitz, R-E-Y-N-I-T-Z, and others that list them, the remaining group stenographers for Hitler, and they had sat in from September 1942 to April 22nd, 1945, and 6 were flown in from Berlin and Munich, and they were taken to Berchtesgaden, and they stayed with the stenographer that Hitler had, and the same team, and the head of the German espionage during World War I, Colonel Walter Nicolai, N-I-C-O-L-A-I. He was the head of the espionage from World War I, which means he began with Reinhard Gehlen's family when Gehlen was very young. And they sat with them, and he said these people had been present at Hitler's headquarters when Roosevelt's death was announced. It was an exciting experience to listen to those men. Now, there's a long story on the Roosevelt demise. I believe he was murdered, and I've mentioned it before and can do more later, but they were all together when it was announced that Roosevelt was dead. And it goes on, this book says that since Hitler had put Dr. Peschel in charge of making his original records of what happened, we let him continue as head of the group, and this arrangement worked out well, though it was not in accordance with the more fervent contemporary conception of denazification. I bring this out because in my quest for Mr. Fritz Kramer, Hitler's general, who Hitler called in for this prolonging the war at the Battle of the Bulge with his top aides, and the other aides and Kramer were at Dachau, and then Kramer disappears from the history books. Then Fritz Kramer, the general, as he disappears, the other Fritz Kramer is manipulating Henry Kissinger into Omer Amagau, where the top generals are after the war. And here it tells you that the historians had a living link with Hitler. They were not supposed to do it. It worked well. They had a continuous group. It wasn't in accordance with denazification. And then this person, George Allen from the 101st Airborne, says, the result was less than a month after these people stopped writing for Hitler, we had them working for us, reconstructing the period. Now, if the Nazis were to go underground, how much information could you get from these people who were writing their own history and intended to research later and put money into a man from Wisconsin who came back as the senator, and they funded him, and he made sure, along with John McCloy, who was making arrangements through the entire war, with Allen Dulles, they made sure that these people got off. Now, that is part of the background of the history of what happened at Berchtesgaden. As soon as the war was over, 2 days before it was officially over, they were beginning this process. Another book that merges on this same point is the background of Ronald Reagan. Where did he get so conservative that the ACLU thinks that he wants to do away with the Bill of Rights? The Conservative Decade, a book by James C. Roberts, describes the emerging leaders of the 1980s, and it was written in 1980, this book. He wrote, published by Arlington House, a CIA press. Now, this book goes into the background, a lot of on the background of the conservatives in power today, but the one that I'm particularly interested in is William Buckley, because he worked for the Central Intelligence Agency in Madrid and in Mexico. He was involved with E. Howard Hunt, the godfather. He was the godfather of Hunt's children. Buckley has been an important spokesman for the intelligence community. His brother, James Buckley, is head of U.S. Information Agency and propaganda today. Their sister is in the Central Intelligence Agency. Another sister was a roommate of Nancy Reagan, or a close associate at Smith College. And William Buckley's career is written up in many books, but it's very clear in this particular book the relationship of him to a power structure and how he got started. And also when William Buckley in 1960 formed the Young Americans for Freedom. On the board of Young Americans for Freedom, YAF, was Ronald Reagan and Colonel Charles Willoughby. Willoughby ends up in Dallas with the people behind the murder of John Kennedy. Reagan is active in the early 60s and 50s with these people and ends up in the White House as their selected man with a team that came from Munich, Germany, to Robert Morris. And Willoughby and Morris and Buckley all work with the Birch Society and with Larry McDonald, who now runs these massive computers with John Reese and Louise Reese and the Pentagon and high officials through Western goals. But in this book, The Conservative Movement, it tells about Buckley in 1953, how he was handpicked by Frank Chodorov, Chodorov. He was picked when he was a recent graduate of Yale University to head an organization called the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists, the ISI, Intercollegiate Society Individualists, the ISI. And it was an organization that this author, who's a conservative, compares to the Students for Democratic Society, the Young Democrats. The only difference is that the money for one group comes from Germany and Eastern Europe, from not Russia, but from Germany and Vienna and Munich, and the other was an American homegrown organization without money from the Soviet Union. Now, in 1953, this organization was formed, and it was in 1951 when Buckley was selected to be head of that organization. And then he goes on in 1955 to form the National Review. Well, Frank Chodorov selected Buckley. He was a much older man, and he was from Illinois. Now, Buckley's sister was a roommate, as I said, with Nancy Reagan, and Loyal Davis from the American Medical Association, a very political organization from Chicago, Illinois, might have or could have known Frank Chodorov from Illinois, from Chicago, the same city, who chose Buckley from the East Coast, and the family was originally from Texas, to go from Yale University to head this organization, and Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. Founded, he handpicked him in 51, but the organization was formed in 53. In 1955, William Buckley began the National Review, and in the biography of William Buckley, in the book about him, it tells you the people that were put on the board of National Review, that escalates it to Germany, to Vienna, to Zurich, to heavy politicians in Europe, and a Mr. Voigt, Voigt, active with monarchists and militarists in Europe, so that Buckley was handpicked for three groups. One for the ISI, the Intercollegiate Society of Individuals. The next was for his National Review, which is really international in flavor. And then Buckley forms the Young Americans for Freedom in 1960. By 57, Reagan was already working with the CIA and the anti-communist leagues, the organizations. I gave you the letters of those, and with the propaganda establishment from out in Hollywood. So by 1960, according to this book, Buckley formed Young Americans for Freedom because with the defeat of Richard Nixon, and with him the Eastern establishment control of the GOP, Young American for Freedom was formed. And of course, I did the broadcast of the people from Munich who came to Robert Morris. Morris was head of the Senate Intelligence and the Investigative Committees of Senator Joe McCarthy. Again, Joe McCarthy and Robert Morris. And then Morris goes down to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He's now head of the University of Texas and works with the Space Station Genocidal L5 Society out of Princeton University. But one of the key pins of this whole operation was the Buckley family, and handpicked from Illinois, first with one organization, then with his National Review, then Young Americans for Freedom, which brings in the conservative Ronald Reagan, Nancy Davis Reagan. She latches onto him out there in Hollywood and is behind and pushes this conservatism as if he needed pushing, but she seems to be as much in control as the Popessa. I haven't read the book yet. I've heard a lot about it. But Nancy Reagan is a very powerful woman, and Buckley was picked by somebody in Illinois, and the Buckley family were associated with Nancy Davis. Goodness knows in Chicago, as I say, the context there. But in this book, it tells how Ronald Reagan surfaced in 1964. At the time, he gave a speech for Barry Goldwater, but he said that among the others, he was known to all of them before. He didn't really surface and come to the attention of most conservatives till 1964, but he had a strong role before that. I'll take a 1-minute break now and go back to these forces of Germany, the Germans, as I say, behind Senator Joe McCarthy, the continuation of the German process, and how they all converge in 1983 with Larry McDonald of the Birch Society, the military, and the list of people that are sent out to 50 police departments around the United States, and also with their offices in Germany at the present time. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. It is side 2 of broadcast number 602, and it's June the 20th, tomorrow, 1983. Tomorrow's the longest day of the year, the beginning of summer. Can you believe that one? The time goes so fast. It's hard for me to say the dates because it seems like there's a new month every time I say the date. Now, getting back to this can of worms known as... I call it the selling out of America. Once you can accept the radical, and it is radical because it is original in terms of my interpretation or research, the idea that there was a smooth continuity from the time that the American corporations funded Adolf Hitler or Mussolini and the war against the Soviet Union, once you can accept the fact that we funded those armies to make war against the Soviet Union, and when they couldn't do it, we retrenched and combined with them to go around for a third time around. This time, World War III will be not fighting the Germans as it was in 1 and 2, but we will be working with them to fight the Soviet Union, and that everything in terms of our bankers, the news media, the professors, the scientists, the military industrialists, everything that they have done has been in collusion along those lines. And there has been a continuity of the Vatican, of the churches, even of the rabbis, the ministers. Nobody has said, we've had enough. What is the origin of all that is going on? Now, if you can accept that radical idea and get books on the history of World War I and the rearmament after World War I and World War II, and after World War II and the sabotage that was going on, once you get those books and you keep in mind what I've been saying on these broadcasts, you will see these pages jump at you with certain names that reoccur over and over again, and you realize that some very rotten, dirty work has been going on. And some of the people behind the scenes, such as Larry McDonald and Robert Morris and Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon and the people behind Senator Joe McCarthy, are very much intact. McCarthyism didn't end. Instead of smearing people, I believe they killed them, and these death squads have wiped out certain people, whether it was to give them cancer or make it look like suicide or car crashes, that there are death squads all over the world to wipe out opposition, as there were in Germany, until 1933 when Hitler came to power. After that, he didn't need any more excuses. He just went ahead and did it. Now, this book on the conservative movement, written in 1980, explains that Ronald Reagan was no longer, he was selected a long time ago, but that the YAFers didn't consider, not Reagan, but Nixon, their own kind in 1972. By 1972, they were supporting Agnew because Nixon had sold out America. Mom, apple pie, and Taiwan, over the Great Wall of China. Now, Seymour Hersh's new book, and I'll be sharing with you information on that, maybe you saw some of the articles, tells about the sabotaging of Richard Nixon when he was in office, and my thesis of why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped was that the YAFers and Spiro Agnew and the Greek military junta wanted to get rid of Richard Nixon, as Louis Tackwood said, and this book tells you that they considered Nixon too soft. Now, the Posse Comitatus considers Ronald Reagan getting too soft, and if he makes the wrong move, they'll wipe him out. He was shot once by John Hinckley, as I say, a member of Posse Comitatus. But to study the network of people who decide who is too liberal to live or die, or who's too conservative if Nixon is too soft, they could simply sabotage him with Scotch tape, and in comes Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, part of that inner Gestapo team, hand-picked and selected long ago. Alexander Haig jumped over, 243 other generals, married the daughter of the commanding officer of the Philippines, and the money going into that base came from Colonel Willoughby, from Madrid, from Spain, from the Falange, directly from Germany to Spain to the Philippines, and Haig was on his way and was active with them in Korea, and that excuse brought in the top Nazis from Europe because the cooling off of the war period became a really hot war, and that was the excuse for bringing in more of Richard Nixon's Nazi friends and associates who funded his campaign. Now, this Frank Chodorov, Chodorov, extremely right-wing person, was the man behind William Buckley, originally older man when Buckley was just out of Yale at the time. And when he formed National Review, getting back to that, in the book The Buckleys, the biography of Buckley, you can get some of the idea of National Review. On page 124, it says its editors were listed. It has James Burnham and some very conservative names that you might know, and L. Brent Bozell, that's his brother-in-law. Frank Chodorov was one of the top people. Medford Evans of the John Birch Society goes directly to Larry MacDonald and that group, Carl Hess, Russell Kirk, and there's a list of people. I don't want to give you too many on the air, but there were foreign contributors, and there was a Mr. F.A. Voigt, V-O-I-G-H-T, from London, and in Paris, a Mr. Ravine, R-A-V-I-N-E-S, and from Taipei, John C. Caldwell, and in Vienna, Eric, E-R-I-K, and then a small v, Kuehnelt, K-U-E-H-N-E-L-T-L-E-D-D-I-H-N, and from Zurich, Wilhelm Ropke, R-O-E-P-K-E. And this book on the Buckleys tells about Mr. Medford Evans, who is the editor. He worked with John Birch Society and has written for American Opinion for years, editor of the White Citizens Council publication, major writer for the John Birch Society. And Mr. Voigt, they described, had dropped from sight, but Mr. Ledeen was a vehement monarchist and militarist who has maintained close ties with National Review. That's out of Zurich. Zurich is where the gun was supplied for Jean when he shot the Pope, and then the far-right Masonic group in Italy said this is an act of war. It was an excuse almost to get to war with the Russians because Jean had allegedly been behind a KGB plan. It came out of Zurich, and Buckley and the CIA have strong ties in Zurich, Switzerland. And this one man, Mr. Ropke, R-O-E-P-K-E, is a very important columnist in Germany who was claimed he said that he had a disciple who was Ludwig Erhard, the man who succeeded Konrad Adenauer as Chancellor of West Germany. These are very political people, and each one of those could be looked into. Alfred Kohlberg was the one-man China lobby, working with Senator Joe McCarthy and Robert Morris and that team going way back. The background of the Buckleys should be explored more continuously, as a matter of fact. Now, in the Warrington Missioneerings, in Volume 18, there's a section on Young Americans for Freedom. It's page 857, and it lists the members of Young Americans for Freedom that was formed in September 1960 at the home of William Buckley. I'm not going through all of those, just about 3 or 4 people that were founding members, because one of them was Ronald Reagan, put on the staff, and Dean Clarence Mannion, the far-right Christian, was there, and Senator Strom Thurmond, working with Frank Turple and J. Peter Grace and John Reese and Larry MacDonald, who I said was the congressman that would be behind. He's the man who kept running the papers to deport John Lennon. That was his project. Senator John Tower, who was involved with passing the papers that spy Marina Oswald could come to this country, the Tsarist Russian, white Russian from Minsk, who latched on to Lee Oswald and got her citizenship by way of marriage to Lee Harvey Oswald. She actually never did get a citizenship. Maybe she has it now. She married Mr. Porter, and she probably is a citizen by now. Colonel Willoughby, Charles Willoughby, Kurt Wiedenbach, the German-American with a mysterious background, William Nolan of the China Lobby. Mrs. Eli Lilly was one of the founders of YAF. I want some time to go into the connections of the coroner in Los Angeles, Thomas Noguchi, and George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Eli Lilly Group. There's a link there. And Robert Morris of Navy Intelligence, Igor Cassini. His mother was part of the Tsarist entourage. They were white Russians who settled in Monte Carlo. For a while he was supposed to marry Grace Kelly, but had been married before, and that was shelved. So there's William Buckley forming this Young Americans for Freedom with Senator Wallace Bennett. It was his office that the men from Watergate worked, G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt. The Bennett office, Mullen Associates, was associated with the Howard Hughes Organization and Mr. Bennett through the Mullen Associates. And of course, having formed the Young Americans for Freedom and their involvement in the Dallas-Fort Worth area with Robert Morris, the Buckleys are a prime mover because of their role, as I say, in Spain and in Mexico, and people involved in these various assassinations. There's a Professor Lev Dobriansky who works with Robert Morris and Colonel Willoughby, General Willoughby, who is deceased now, John Wayne. But some of these names, John Tower, Strom Thurmond, William Buckley, Igor Cassini, Dobriansky, Barry Goldwater, William Nolan, Mrs. Lilly, Robert Morris, are very important to the way that John Kennedy was removed, and so that their agent Richard Nixon would get in power, and then Nixon is removed so that the agent from Young Americans for Freedom in his organization can get Ronald Reagan as president. July 21st, 1980, there was a story in the Washington Post, Reagan's triumph parallels Young American for Freedom's resurgence. And it tells how proud they are that for 16 years they've been pushing for the nomination of Ronald Reagan as president. In 1980, they were bragging about that they had been working on this since 1964. 1964 was the year Kennedy, 1 month after Kennedy was murdered, and the YF were brought in, a team of them from Munich, Germany, for that occasion. And they're very happy, and they refer to Tom Charles Houston, H-U-S-T-O-N, the famed COINTEL, the counterintelligence program, the Operation Chaos, out of Indiana. Incidentally, out of Indiana is where the Birch Society was originally formed, in Indiana. Indiana is the location of the COINTEL, the Houston Operation Chaos, to combine military, FBI, CIA, the Pentagon, the Defense Department in opening mail, assassination teams, burglaries, planting evidence. The MK Ultra, the mind control program, came out of there. That's where Spiro Agnew went to a foundation when he was kicked out of government as vice president and caught with his finger in various payoffs. And that's where Emily and William Harris came from, and Angela Gary Atwood, to come to the West Coast to form the CIA's SLA. As I wrote in the SLA, as the CIA in Indiana. Also publishes Bob Merrill's publisher from Indiana did Sylvia Maher's book, Accessories After the Fact. And this may just be a coincidence, but I'd have to look into more about that publishing firm, because that's the book that left out the 26 people from Young Americans for Freedom and Robert Morris, and her index also that she published on the Warren Commission hearings. Now, pertinent to all of this activity that continuously ties into Larry McDowell and his operation is that man Charles Willoughby, the counterpart of Fritz Kramer. Was waiting to do more on Willoughby until I could really resolve the matter whether Fritz Kramer is Hitler's general, the one that ran our Pentagon and works with General Graham at the present time on the space operations and trade, international trade. But Kevin Coogan, who's done this magnificent work on the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, sent me 2 articles about Willoughby, and we'll be doing a lot more on those. One is called, To Whet Your Appetite, From Heidelberg to Madrid, the story of General Willoughby. This was published in the Reporter, August 19th, 1952, and I'll make reprints for you and figure out how many pages it is. And there's another story in the Reporter called General MacArthur and His Vanishing War History. And this has to do with Willoughby and Douglas MacArthur. This was October 14th, 1952. I'll get these out to you because they're very important. And I also have sent to some researchers, and if you want copies, I'll get out to you an article written for the U.S. Farm News, March 1973, by Morris Kaminsky. Now, this article brings up General Charles Willoughby. He's the man who was Karl Wiedenbeck, a German name, who changes it to a very refined, accepted English name. And this story in the Farm News refers to a book that I haven't seen and will try to get. It's called The Study of a Master Spy, published in London in 1961 by Bob Edwards. And this book tells how Allen Dulles of the Central Intelligence Agency carried on secret conferences with representatives of Hitler's SS February and March 1943. Now get those dates straight, because as I say, when I get into the Robert Byron Watson story of the Larry McDonald team working with Walter Rauff, the Nazi war criminal in Chile, and with George Habash and the assassination teams and drug dealers of the Middle East. Keep in mind that the Nazi connections just didn't sprout up. Klaus Barbie just didn't happen to be protected by the American government in 1945. It took a lot of planning to know what to do with these people when the war was over. And I referred to Kurt Riess's book, The Nazis Go Underground, to show the meetings that Hitler had and where they planned from 1943, the exact dates, up to 1945, even delaying the Battle of the Bulge for 7 months in order to get the gold and the jewels and the money out of Europe to make sure that all the arrangements were made to protect their top people after the war. But for the Germans to make such plans and decided, or for SS Karl Wolff to work with Allen Dulles in Switzerland and with the Vatican simultaneously, and they were to write the passports for these Nazis and Nazi money to send us this man from the Navy, Joe McCarthy, who was to become the senator and release more of these people from the Dachau trials. The important thing is not only did the Germans have this in mind, but Allen Dulles moved to Switzerland in 1943, and I said this must be for the express purpose of doing what they were doing. So when they couldn't win the war against the Soviet Union, Allen Dulles of Chase Manhattan Bank, of the law offices of the Rockefellers and multinational corporations, was working as early as February and March, and it's detailed in this book, and I have to get it. And of course, this long article has to do with the survival of Martin Bormann, the arrangements for Martin Bormann to get out, and also for Herman Abst, who's currently the head of the Vatican Bank, along with 3 other people investigating or covering up their connections. In 1973, that was 10 years ago, Morris Kaminsky was writing about top Nazis in the Pentagon. He says that John Kennedy personally put in the office of the Pentagon a war criminal, loyal confidant of Adolf Hitler. His name was Adolf Husinger, Heusinger, to become head of NATO military planning, and he was a Nazi war criminal. And Kurt George Kiesinger, as Chancellor of West Germany, and Franz Joseph Strauss were working with the Americans. I've mentioned Kiesinger in relationship to the Munich massacre and the Olympic Games and the top Nazis. So this article, I will bring out more details that are share them with you by Morris Kaminsky, and I can get it to you. But the very people that he mentioned in 1973, Dr. Walter Becher, B-E-C-H-E-R, I'll go back to Robert Morris. He mentions Willoughby, the top Nazis, the government and corporation of Nazis, and Martin Bormann, and he tells that these teams were made up and mentions people by name, and the names he mentions are people that are in the news today that we read about all the time. They're not dead issues. In 1973, those names were brought out in a bulletin in the U.S. Farm News, and they're very important, and they're more important because people like Larry McDonald have access with computers to every police department in the United States and the Birch Society. And the origins of the Birch Society go back to people like Revillo Oliver, who on the 4th of July a few years back spoke in Boston and said every Jew in America should be gassed. These organizations are not just little old ladies in tennis shoes, as Justice Mosk said a while back. As a matter of fact, after he made that remark, a man from Pasadena who was familiar with the assassination teams took me to his office in Pasadena and clued me on to the seriousness of the Birch Society years and years ago when I was still living in Los Angeles. He so resented the fact that it was passed off by Mr. Mosk, who was also a legal consultant to the Warren Commission hearings, along with Allen Dulles and John J. McCloy, and Earl Warren and Mr. Russell from Georgia, and Gerald Ford, and Leon Jaworski. I think it's been 20 years since Kennedy was murdered. Can you see the cast of characters who covered up the slaying of the President of the United States? And in the last 10 minutes before I go into some more on Robert Byron Watson, I might tell you that this last year, October 28th, Representative Larry McDonald was speaking at the League of Women Voters in Marietta, Georgia, and he said that Mr. Hess, the Nazi war criminal Rudolf Hess, should be released out of the prison because he would be very valuable for his fight against communism. He would be invaluable. Congressman Larry McDonald told the League of Women Voters, and this was before the Hitler diary furor. Now, the story of the diaries with all the top Nazis in the DESA network that was exposed, I said the It had to do with the seriousness of the Nazi network. I don't take those diaries as being the fraud that they said they were. It was all hushed up very quickly when the network of top Nazis who worked with Allen Dulles and Larry McDonald all surfaced. But before the diaries appeared, and when they did, the excuse was to release Mr. Hess out of Spandau prison. But earlier, those diaries just broke the first of the year. Earlier, Larry McDonald, October 28th of this year, was saying that Hess should have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize and that he's so valuable to America and to tell us about the Nazis. And when he was saying that, that was October the 28th, 1982, the London Times, 1 week later, November the 7th, 1982, had the story of Hess, and it said with him he took to Britain to see Winston Churchill in May of 1941, secrets and names of people in the British government that were important to him. Now, these names are supposed to be locked up for another 30 or 40 years, but I understand that new book on Goebbels' diary actually mentions them. And the London Times has some of the people. And the names that are mentioned here are people sympathetic to Adolf Hitler who wanted Great Britain to become part of Germany and combine forces. There's a picture of some of these people. The names Hess brought with him to Britain: Mr. Hoare, H-O-A-R-E, Mr. Douglas, Mr. Butler, Percy, Lothian, O'Malley, and I can go through some of these with you if you want me to. These are important people related to high government officials, some of them high government officials at the time in London and in power today, and the names were in possession of Rudolf Hess. They were handed to him by Hitler. They were the promises of top people in the government that they would go along with the Fuhrer. Hess was the secretary to the Fuhrer. Now, this is the man that wanted to use the entire British government to help fight Russia and make the world safe for Nazi Germany. And here is Larry McDonald 1 week earlier saying that Hess should get the Nobel Peace Prize and that he's such a valuable person and that he would help Western goals, the think tank, his mentality by giving clues as to world communism. He would be invaluable. Does that give you a little clue of what Western goals is like with Interpol, Hitler's police agency, with J. Edgar Hoover's list, with Robert Morris's list from Senator Joe McCarthy days, from Louise Reese's, John Reese's wife. She works for Larry McDonald, her list from the House Un-American Activity, and then add to it all the newspaper articles and protest movements that are going on today, and it's in the hands of these people. Now, just in the remaining time, I want to continue. Last week, I talked about a letter I got in December 76 from Robert Byron Watson. David Wemple wrote to me a month later, January 21st, and he didn't know if I was familiar with Watson or not, and just the essence, a few points about his letter. He said, "Dear May, Robert Watson is in a Miami prison. He claims he was framed." I talked about the framing last week. He says, "This is what he is telling me from his affidavit that I've enclosed for you, that Larry McDonald of Marietta, Georgia, now a congressman in the U.S. House of Representatives, is closely associated with Jerry Adams from the American Silver Company." Now, on broadcast 471, I talked about Mark David Chapman, Lenin's assassin, who worked in Marietta, Georgia with Tony Adams, and they sent him to Beirut, Lebanon, and this is where Ajah was trained with Frank Turple to kill and do the shooting that almost killed the Pope. I don't know if Tony Adams is related to Jerry Adams, but they're from the same city, and both of them worked with George Habash and Larry McDonald over in Beirut, Lebanon, and with the Central Intelligence Agency, and with Strom Thurmond and Frank Turple. Worked with Strom Thurmond, and Thurmond and Reese all worked with J. Peter Grace and the International Nazi Network, and they would have a good motive to get rid of John Lennon because he could have peace demonstrations equal to what the Pope is having in Poland to incite problems against the Soviet Union. He wrote to me about Jerry Adams, and on broadcast 471 I talk about Tony Adams from the same city. He said he's also associated with Mr. Herman Jackson. I gave you his alias last week, Walter Alfred Jack Youngblood, a fellow involved allegedly, possibly at the Dealey Plaza when John Kennedy was killed, and also involved with the murder of Martin Luther King. He wrote to me that they were involved in the summer of '74 with gold smuggling operations in South America, in Chile, and he mentions 4 different countries, and all of those countries in 1974 and currently and in the past were important to the United States government. One was Chile. That's where the Nazis have their border between Argentina. Chile this government was put in by 1974 by Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger and John McCone, who was CIA director when Kennedy was killed. They murdered Allende and were active in narcotics traffic and police state operations in Chile. He mentions Peru in 1974. Klaus Barbie had headquarters in Peru and then went to Bolivia and ran his cocaine operation, working for the CIA and the Gestapo, the current Gestapo, and the Masonic Liceo Gelli operation out of Italy, the International Odessa. He mentions Colombia, where they were active, and that has been exposed just recently for the large cocaine operations. We know what comes into this country from Colombia, particularly the Hollywood connections, the cocaine operations on the West Coast, and Costa Rica in 1974. That's where Robert Vesco went for asylum so that he wouldn't be prosecuted with William Casey and Bernie Cornfield, and he still continues his operations. He's in Algiers, I understand, at the present time. And Vesco and Bernie Cornfield are still doing their thing internationally and nationally. He talks about the gold smuggling operation in 1974, the people he worked with, and with Larry McDonald. He said Larry McDonald was aware of the source of campaign funds coming out of narcotics traffic and so forth. And of course his partner in Western Gold is Roy Cohn, never far removed from the syndicate. He also mentions John Tower as being part of the international syndicate, and John Tower, along with Ronald Reagan and Colonel Willoughby and Robert Morris, the close associated team going back to 1960, Young Americans for Freedom. John Tower is named by Robert Byron Watson at this time in his letters as being part of that syndicate. And of course, John Tower is married to Samuel Cummings' sister. Samuel Cummings runs the CIA operation. He's from Philadelphia. He's the arms supplier for Carlos and George Habash, and for the Chilean government and the dictatorships, and for Wilson and Turple and Corcola, and anyone else who wants to buy his weapons. He is the brother-in-law of Senator John Tower, who is described as part of the syndicate. Now, he describes the syndicate in his letter, according to Robert Byron Watson, as a group of wealthy multimillionaires who are interested in narcotics, but he also mentions Walter Ralph and his connection. And my definition of the syndicate is the Odessa, or Despine, S-P-I-E-N-N-E, the Spider, the Nazi network, the Nazis, the intelligence community, and the narcotics and the gun running. Those four operations, and in that article in Mother Jones on the Vatican, you get the role of all of these and the Vatican combined. Religious institutions are part of it. The countries have no boundaries. The idea is profit and hate and control. Anti-Semitic, anti-black, racist, flooding narcotics into this country at huge profits and controlling the politicians. And of course that gets back to people like Paul Laxalt with his buddy in the White House at the present time. Now, this letter from David Wemple goes into Dr. Ballack is working for the CIA. I mentioned that last week, and setting up the Black September group and the PFLP, a popular front for the liberation of Palestine. Their goal is to wipe out the entire country of Israel. And of course, the J. Peter Grace, who works with Otto Ambrose and the early Nazis, the I.G. Farben network, go directly to John Reese. I'll do more on that soon, and Larry McDonald, so that the names of the Vatican bankers, the agents of World War II, are continuously reappearing with these same characters day after day. The work is getting more interesting because the names keep reappearing, the same countries and the same names. And this Robert Byron Watson is talking about using a Sirhan from the Palestinian group for the murder of, he didn't know who it would be used for, he'd be used for, because he didn't hear them discuss the Robert Kennedy assassination, but he heard them discuss the Martin Luther King murder 1 week before King was murdered. So that the letter that I got from David Wemple goes into detail, new material, some of it is new material, but similar to what Robert Byron wrote to me. But he put in his letter to David Wemple, I wrote to Bernard Fensterwald, and that was ironic because he thought Fensterwald would help him. And Fensterwald, of course, works for the Central Intelligence Agency. and did nothing about the case of Robert Byron Watson. As a matter of fact, Fensterwald became James Earl Ray's attorney, and you didn't hear him bring up the fact that Mr. Youngblood and these people were bragging about killing Martin Luther King. Fensterwald does not clear the patsy, James Earl Ray, because he had some role in the operation, but he makes sure that the other part doesn't come out. And that's what a CIA attorney does when he gets attached to a CIA case like this. Well, Mr. McDonald not only wants Hess out, so does the team in Germany that got together that pulled this diary story. They surfaced as very much intact, but when the story broke in the Los Angeles Times about the relationship of Larry McDonald's operation, Western Goals, to the LA Times, it broke May 24th. It's been hushed up ever since. I haven't seen a thing about it. The Birch Society has, as I say, strong links to Ravillo Oliver, to the racists, to the anti-Semites, the entire network that goes deep into the posse comitatus, and that takes a full cycle. Again, back to the news of today with the picture of Senator Joe McCarthy and these far right-wingers that intend to be armed in 50 states, they say, and take the law into their own hands. We'll have to do more of this next week because our time is out. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell. It's KAZUFM in Pacific Grove, California, and I'll be back with you next week.